The year was 1945. Europe lay in ruins. Entire cities were nothing more than piles of bricks and ash. Millions wandered through the wreckage, searching for food, family, or meaning. The war was over, but peace had not yet arrived. The world had stopped fighting, yet it hadn't begun to heal. In the midst of the chaos, a new kind of war quietly began. A war not fought with tanks or bullets, but with knowledge, secrets, and minds. This was the true beginning of the Cold War, and its first battle had a name: Operation Paperclip. Officially, the Allied forces came to Germany to bring justice, to expose the crimes of the Nazi regime, and to ensure that such evil would never rise again. But behind the tribunals, behind the cameras and speeches, something else was happening, something silent and strategic. The United States had realized that justice could wait, knowledge could not. Because within the wreckage of the Third Reich were men whose intellect had built the deadliest weapons of the century, men who had created technologies far beyond their time. Some had designed the V-2 rocket, the terrifying weapon that fell silently from the skies over London and Antwerp, killing thousands without warning. Others had studied the human body in horrifying ways, conducting experiments in concentration camps, all in the name of science. And yet, instead of facing punishment, many of these men were about to receive a second chance and a new identity. It began quietly. American intelligence officers were instructed to find and extract the most talented German scientists before the Soviets could reach them. The race for scientific power had begun, and both sides knew that whoever controlled the knowledge of the Nazis would control the future. Among those targeted was a name that would later become legendary: Wernher von Braun. He was young, ambitious, and brilliant, the man who had led Hitler's rocket program. His V-2 missiles had been hailed as miracles of engineering and weapons of vengeance. But behind that miracle was a nightmare. Thousands of prisoners from concentration camps were forced to build those rockets in underground factories, where many died from exhaustion, starvation, or execution. Von Braun knew all of it. He saw it. But when Germany fell, he made a choice. He gathered his team, destroyed key documents, and waited, not for capture, but for opportunity. That opportunity came in the form of Operation Paperclip, a secret American intelligence project designed to smuggle German scientists into the United States. Its purpose was simple: use Nazi knowledge to outpace the Soviets. The program's name came from the paperclips attached to the files of selected scientists. Those with a paperclip on their dossier were to be relocated to America. Officially, they were screened for Nazi affiliations. In reality, many records were altered, rewritten, or erased entirely. Men who once worked for the Third Reich were now being welcomed by the same country that had fought and bled to destroy it. In late 1945, von Braun and more than 100 of his engineers were secretly flown to the United States. They were settled in New Mexico at Fort Bliss, where they began working on missile programs for the U.S. Army. Within years, their research would form the foundation of America's rocket and space technology. But not everyone knew the truth. The public was told these were German specialists who had been screened and cleared. Newspapers wrote about their brilliance. They were portrayed as visionary scientists helping humanity reach for the stars. No one spoke about their past, about the thousands who died building their inventions, or the oaths they once swore to Adolf Hitler. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials justified their decision. "If we don't take them, the Russians will," one general said. And that was true. The Soviet Union had its own program, Operation Paperclip, capturing entire research facilities and thousands of scientists. It was a race not for justice, but for dominance. And so, morality was traded for strategy. Justice was delayed, perhaps forever. Wernher von Braun became the face of America's space ambitions. He worked for the U.S. Army, then for NASA, leading the team that developed the Saturn V rocket, the machine that took humans to the moon. Millions cheered when Apollo 11 launched in 1969. Few knew that the man behind it had once worn a Nazi uniform. The United States, the land of freedom, had quietly built its future on the minds of those who once served tyranny. Operation Paperclip officially ended in 1959, but its legacy never did. Many of its scientists went on to receive awards, positions of power, and even citizenship. Their pasts were buried, their crimes forgotten. And so, in the shadows of victory, a question remained. Can humanity truly move forward when its progress is built on denial? When truth is rewritten for the sake of power? History remembers wars for their battles, but the real wars, the silent ones, are fought in the spaces between morality and ambition. Operation Paperclip was one of those wars. It was not about weapons or nations. It was about the human soul and the price we are willing to pay for progress. When the war ended, the world demanded justice. The Nuremberg trials became the stage where the victors promised to punish the crimes of the defeated. Cameras rolled, judges spoke, and the world saw Nazi leaders face the gallows. But behind that display of morality, another story was unfolding, one that was never meant to be televised. For every Nazi officer tried in Nuremberg, another slipped quietly into a new life under a new name, many of them protected by the same governments that condemned them. It wasn't chaos, it was strategy. The Cold War had already begun. The Soviet Union was no longer an ally but a rival, and America needed an edge. In the mind of the Pentagon, German science was that edge. The scientists who once designed death were now seen as the architects of the future. Men who experimented on prisoners, developed poison gases, and engineered rockets that terrorized cities were suddenly labeled as assets. Their expertise could not be wasted, not in a world where Stalin was racing for nuclear weapons and rockets of his own. So the US government began to cleanse the records. Entire Nazi affiliations were deleted from files. Personnel who had served under the SS were recategorized as non-political engineers. And for every name that was too toxic to erase, new ones were created. But there were ghosts. Journalists and researchers who dug too deep began to find strange inconsistencies. Missing files, changed birth dates, deleted military ranks. When one journalist inquired about von Braun's Nazi party membership, a government spokesman replied, he was forced to join. That was the standard excuse, one that turned perpetrators into victims and victims into statistics. Meanwhile, in the Soviet-occupied zone, the same thing was happening on the other side. The Russians had seized entire factories and thousands of technicians in Operation Aviakim, the mirror image of Paperclip. Between 1946 and 1950, both superpowers built their military and technological strength on the same foundation, the knowledge of the Third Reich. The war had not truly ended, it had simply changed its form. In Washington, Paperclip scientists became part of a new mythology, the myth of the brilliant immigrant genius who helped America rise to greatness. Magazines praised their work, avoiding the shadows behind their careers. Von Braun appeared in Life magazine, smiling beside American generals. Hubertus Strughold lectured at medical schools. Their accents, once symbols of the enemy, became symbols of excellence. The world believed the war had ended. But the truth is, the victors inherited the sins of the defeated. Justice had been promised. Instead, convenience had prevailed. Operation Paperclip had succeeded, not just in transferring science, but in transferring guilt. The laboratories of America were now haunted by ghosts in white coats. And as rockets soared higher, the line between redemption and corruption grew thinner, until no one could tell the difference. By 1950, the United States stood at the edge of a new age, the atomic, the aerial, and soon the cosmic. But beneath every triumph, there lingered a question the nation dared not ask. If our progress is born from the minds of war criminals, then what does that make us? The 1950s were years of triumph, or so the world believed. America stood tall, victorious, free, and powerful. Rockets were rising from desert sands, jet engines screamed across the sky, and a new dream was being born, the dream of conquering space. But behind that dream were men whose hands were not clean. The engineers of the Nazi war machine were now the architects of the American future. At Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, Werner von Braun's team worked tirelessly under military secrecy. their mission to develop missiles that could deliver nuclear warheads across continents. The same man who once built weapons for Hitler was now building them for Washington. He was no longer Sturmbannführer von Braun. He was Dr. Werner von Braun, the smiling visionary of American rocketry. The press adored him. He spoke fluent English, made jokes, and never mentioned the concentration camps. Television shows invited him to talk about science and space exploration. In 1955, he even appeared in a Disney special explaining the future of manned spaceflight to American children. The audience saw a genius. No one saw the shadows behind him. When truth is inconvenient, myth takes its place. Von Braun's transformation was not unique. Across the United States, dozens of paperclip scientists were quietly shaping the nation's most secret projects, from guided missiles to biological weapons. At Fort Detrick, former Nazi doctors worked on experiments with chemical and biological warfare. Their research, once condemned as inhuman, was now justified as necessary for national security. One intelligence officer wrote in 1952, "We are not recruiting Nazis, we are employing scientists." A clever lie. One word changed everything. Hubertus Struckel, once accused of human experimentation, was now lecturing NASA physicians on how to keep astronauts alive in space. His portrait would later hang in the U.S. Air Force's School of Aerospace Medicine, celebrated as a pioneer, not a war criminal. Other scientists contributed to the design of jet engines, submarine systems, and high-altitude pressure chambers. Everywhere you looked, the fingerprints of the Third Reich had been carefully polished away. Meanwhile, the Cold War was escalating. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb. The arms race had begun, and paranoia ruled the airwaves. In that climate of fear, morality became a luxury. The United States could not afford to be moral, only superior. That was the logic whispered in Pentagon offices, in NASA boardrooms, in the corridors of the CIA. If we don't use these men, the Soviets will. It was true, but it was also the perfect excuse. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. The beeping of that small metal sphere was more than a scientific achievement. It was a declaration. The US had been beaten to space. The panic that followed reshaped history. Congress demanded answers. The military blamed bureaucracy. And behind closed doors, officials gave von Braun's team everything they had ever wanted: money, freedom, and power. The same scientists who once built weapons for Hitler were now America's last hope in the space race. The past was not erased, it was rebranded. By 1960, NASA had been created. Werner von Braun became the chief architect of the Saturn rocket program, the engine that would one day carry men to the moon. To the public, he was a hero, the symbol of American innovation. But few knew that in the tunnels of Mittelwerk, where his V-2 rockets were once built, 20,000 prisoners had died, their bodies buried under the same soil where the future of spaceflight had been born. When reporters asked him later about those deaths, von Braun answered coldly, "In war, there are tragedies." Tragedies. That was his word for it. The United States, drunk on its technological success, never looked back. Paperclip had become part of the foundation of modern science, invisible, unacknowledged, yet essential. And as rockets soared toward the heavens, the ghosts of the past watched silently from below. In those years, something strange happened, not just in laboratories, but in the public imagination. Science became a religion. The men who once served ideology now served progress. The white coats replaced the uniforms, but the belief remained the same, that knowledge justified everything. To question that belief was to question the future itself. The world was entering a new age of worship, not of gods or kings, but of scientists. They promised salvation through machines, redemption through rockets, immortality through discovery. But the price of that faith was memory. By the time President Kennedy announced in 1961 that America would go to the moon, von Braun's name was written into history as a patriot, a genius, a visionary. Few remembered that his first rockets had fallen on London, not the moon. Few cared that his dream of space had been born in a war of annihilation. In the end, it didn't matter. America needed heroes, and von Braun, the man who once built weapons for Hitler, became one of its greatest.